The night a 70-year-old security guard looked at me and whispered, "Is that your wife?" My world cracked open. I thought he was confused. I thought he had the wrong man. But when he said, "Come with me, you need to see this yourself," I followed him. And what I saw through that glass door rewrote 23 years of marriage in a single breath. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to channel. I always believed that if my marriage ever fell apart, I would see it coming. There would be arguments, slammed doors, long nights of silence. There would be warning signs, cold dinners, colder eyes. But the truth is, betrayal does not knock. It does not shout. Sometimes it simply waits in a well-lit parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday evening, wearing a fluorescent security vest and speaking in a tired, careful voice. That was how it began for me. My name is Imran Malik. I am 49 years old, a father of 2 grown daughters, and until that night, I believed I was a man with a stable life. My wife, Sana, and I had been married for 23 years. We were not perfect, but we were steady. Or at least, I thought we were. Sana was the kind of woman people admired quietly. Soft-spoken, elegant, without trying. She had been a school teacher when we met, standing in the courtyard of her parents' home, her dupatta slipping from her head as she laughed at something my mother had said. I remember thinking that day that she looked like someone I could trust with my whole future. And for years, I did exactly that. We built a life the slow, honest way. I worked as a procurement manager for a construction company in Lahore. Long hours, steady pay. We bought a modest home in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Our daughters, Ariba and Hira, grew up in that house. Birthday cakes in the kitchen, exam stress at the dining table, late-night tea with Sana when the girls were finally asleep. Marriage to me was not fireworks. It was routine. It was coming home tired and knowing someone had kept the lights on. It was arguing over bills and still sitting side by side during Friday prayers. It was trust. At least, that's what I thought. The Tuesday it happened started like any other. Sana told me she had a parent-teacher meeting that would run late. She had returned to teaching 2 years ago after both girls left for university. She said it gave her purpose again. I supported that. I was proud of her for wanting more than just waiting for me to come home every evening. That day, I finished work earlier than expected. A client meeting was canceled. It was just past 6:30 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot of a small commercial plaza near Goldberg. I had stopped there to pick up a document from a printing shop before heading home. The sun had nearly set, leaving a bruised purple sky behind the buildings. The parking lights had already flickered on. I parked, stepped out, and was about to lock my car when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, sir." I turned to see an elderly security guard standing near the entrance gate. He looked about 70, maybe older. His beard was mostly white, trimmed close to his face. His uniform hung slightly loose on his thin frame, but his eyes were sharp, observant. "Yes," I said politely. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary. Then his gaze shifted past me toward the far end of the parking lot. His voice lowered. "Is that your wife?" I frowned. "What?" He nodded subtly towards the silver sedan parked near the back. My heart skipped, not because I suspected anything, but because I recognized the car. It was ours, Sana's car. I laughed softly. "Yes, that's my wife's car. Why?" The old man's face didn't change. No smile, no apology. Just something careful. "She comes here often," he said quietly. "I thought you should know." A strange heat rose in my chest. "She has a meeting nearby," I replied quickly, almost defensively. "There's a tutoring center on the second floor." The guard's eyes didn't leave mine. "Sir," he said gently, "come with me. You need to see this yourself." There are moments in life when your body reacts before your mind catches up. My feet felt heavier, but I followed him, not because I believed him, but because something in his tone, something solemn and almost regretful, made it impossible not to. We walked towards the building's side corridor instead of the main entrance. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us. My pulse had begun to pound in my ears. "This way," he murmured. We stopped near a glass door that led to a cafe tucked behind the plaza. I had never noticed it before. It was quiet inside, softly lit with only a few occupied tables. I don't remember driving home that night. I remember the red glow of brake lights in front of me, the faint hum of traffic, and the way my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pale. But I don't remember the turns I made or the signals I followed. My mind was somewhere else, still standing behind that glass door, still watching my wife smile at another man like he was the safest place in the world. When I reached our house, the porch light was on. It always was. Sana liked to leave it on for me, said it made the house feel welcoming. That night, it felt like a lie glowing in the dark. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before stepping out. The house looked the same. The curtains still hung slightly crooked in the living room window. The jasmine plant near the gate still leaned toward the street. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:12 p.m. She was still at the cafe. Still laughing, perhaps. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, but my throat was so tight I could barely swallow. I looked around at the details I had stopped noticing years ago. The chipped corner of the dining table, the framed graduation photo of Ariba, the small crack in the ceiling we had promised to fix. These were the artifacts of the shared life, 23 years of shared life. And suddenly, I wondered if I had been living it alone. I went to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her side was neat, as always, the pillow fluffed, the blanket folded back precisely. I reached out and touched her pillow, pressing my palm into the soft fabric. It still smelled faintly of her perfume. That scent used to comfort me. That night, it felt unfamiliar. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, replaying every memory of the past year, searching for clues. Had she been distant? Yes, but life gets busy. Had she laughed less with me? Maybe, but we were older now. Had she seemed distracted? Of course, everyone is distracted. I had explained away every shift in her behavior as ordinary wear and tear of marriage. I told myself long-term love was quieter. I told myself comfort replaced passion. I told myself that stability mattered more than excitement. And maybe that was true. But what if I had mistaken neglect for stability? At 9:03 p.m., I heard her key in the door. My heart began pounding again, louder this time. I sat up slowly. Her footsteps moved through the hallway. Then she appeared in the bedroom doorway, smiling softly. "You're home early," she said, surprised. Her voice was calm, normal, perfectly practiced. I studied her face carefully. There was no guilt written there, no sign that she had just spent 2 hours across a small cafe table from another man. "Meeting went well?" I asked, forcing my tone to remain steady. She nodded, placing her handbag on the dresser. "Yes, just the usual concerns. Exams are coming up." She began removing her earrings, her movements relaxed. I watched her hands. those same hands that had rested beneath someone else's. I felt something inside me fracture quietly. "You look tired," she added, glancing at me through the mirror. I almost laughed at that. Tired. That was one word for it. "Long day," I replied. She walked closer and sat beside me on the bed. "You should sleep early," she said gently. "You've been working too hard lately." Her concern sounded genuine, and that was what hurt the most, because either she was a brilliant actress or she had already divided her heart so neatly that she could comfort one man after holding hands with another. I wanted to confront her. The words hovered on my tongue. Who is he? How long? Why? But fear stopped me. Not fear of her answer, fear of confirmation. Because as long as I did not say it aloud, some small, foolish part of me could still pretend I was mistaken, that the guard had misunderstood, that I had misread the scene, that there was context I had missed. "She's going to shower," she said, standing up. She walked into the bathroom, and moments later I heard the water running. I sat there, staring at the closed door. My reflection in the mirror across the room looked older than I remembered. When did the gray in my beard become so noticeable? When had the lines around my eyes deepened? I suddenly saw myself as she might see me. Predictable, routine, safe, maybe too safe. The water shut off. I quickly lay down and pretended to scroll through my phone. When she returned, her hair damp, wrapped in a towel, she slid into bed beside me. She smelled of jasmine soap, the same scent she had worn for years. She turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room. "Good night," she whispered. I lay there stiffly, 1,000 memories pressed against my chest. Our wedding day, her nervous smile beneath her veil, the first night we brought Ariba home from the hospital, the way she cried when Hurrah left for university. Were those moments real, or did I only imagine their depth? I didn't sleep. I listened to her breathing beside me, steady and peaceful. Around midnight, she shifted closer in her sleep, her hand resting lightly on my arm. The instinct to hold her was still there. My body remembered what my heart was beginning to doubt, but I didn't move. I lay awake until dawn, staring into darkness, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. The next morning, she woke before me, as usual. I heard her in the kitchen making tea, the familiar clink of cups, the soft hum of a song under her breath. It was a song she used to sing when the girls were small. I closed my eyes, listening. How could everything sound the same when nothing was? When I joined her in the kitchen, she handed me a cup with a small smile. "You barely slept. Work stress?" I looked at her carefully. "Something like that," I said. She nodded sympathetically. "You should consider taking a few days off." The irony almost broke me. I wanted to ask her if she needed days off too, days off from pretending. But instead, I sipped my tea and watched the steam rise between us like a fragile barrier. After breakfast, she picked up her handbag again. "I have another meeting after school," she said casually. Another meeting. The words felt heavier now. I nodded slowly. "Of course you do." She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if sensing something in my tone. But then she leaned forward and kissed my forehead. A simple gesture, familiar, routine, and completely devastating. When she left, I remained standing in the doorway long after her car disappeared from view. The house felt larger, emptier. I walked back inside and sat at the dining table, staring at the spot where she had placed my tea. That was when I realized something important. The betrayal was not just in the cafe. It was here, in the lies layered gently into daily life, in the calm way she spoke about meetings that did not exist, in the normalcy she maintained so flawlessly. And for the first time in 23 years, I began to question not just her loyalty. That morning, after she left, I didn't go to work. I called in sick for the first time in years. My voice sounded unfamiliar to me as I spoke to my assistant, clipped and distant, like I was discussing someone else's schedule. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the blank television screen. I told myself I needed clarity. I told myself I needed facts. But beneath that, there was something more fragile. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Around noon, I found myself driving back to the same commercial plaza. I didn't plan it. My hands just turned the steering wheel in that direction. The parking lot looked different in daylight, less mysterious, less threatening, almost ordinary. The elderly security guard was standing near the entrance again, leaning slightly on a metal railing. When he saw me, recognition flickered across his face. He straightened immediately. I walked toward him slowly. "You came back," he said quietly. I nodded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The daylight made everything feel more exposed. "I need to know how long," I said finally. My voice was steadier than I expected. He exhaled gently. "I have been on this shift almost a year. I noticed her about maybe 7, 8 months ago. At first, I thought it was nothing, but they come regularly, twice a week, always in the evening." Twice a week. The words echoed in my head like a hammer striking metal. 8 months. That was more than a mistake. That was commitment. "They never argue," he added softly. "They sit close. They talk for a long time." I swallowed. "Do they ever—" I couldn't finish the sentence. He understood anyway. He hesitated before answering. "I have seen him hold her hand. Once he kissed her forehead before she left." My chest tightened. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to absorb it without collapsing. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, because as painful as the truth was, living inside uncertainty would have been worse. I walked toward the cafe entrance this time. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. The air smelled of coffee and warm bread. The same corner table stood near the window, empty now. I sat there deliberately. I wanted to feel what she had felt sitting in that chair. The cushion was soft, the table small and intimate. From here, you could see the parking lot clearly, but outsiders couldn't easily see in. It was the perfect place for secrecy disguised as simplicity. A young waiter approached. "Sir, what can I get you?" I glanced at the menu, though I wasn't hungry. "Just tea." As I waited, I imagined them sitting across from each other. What did they talk about? Did she tell him about our daughters? About the house we built together? Did she speak of me? And if she did, how did she describe me? The safe husband? The predictable one? The man she had outgrown? The tea arrived. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the heat ground me. I wasn't an emotional man by nature. I believed in solving problems logically, and so I began to analyze. When have things shifted between us? 8 months ago. I traced back through memory. That was around the time Sana had insisted on updating her wardrobe. She said she wanted to feel fresh returning to teaching. She had started wearing lighter makeup. She joined a gym, though she rarely went before. I had admired her effort, encouraged it, proud that she was investing in herself. I never once considered she might be preparing for someone else's gaze. A slow, heavy realization settled over me. This had not been spontaneous. It had been deliberate, carefully layered into her life while I remained oblivious. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from her. "Long meeting today. Don't wait up for dinner." I stared at the words until they blurred. Long meeting. The lie rolled off her fingers effortlessly. I typed back, "Okay, take your time." Even as I sent it, I hated myself a little for cooperating, for pretending. But I needed to see it through. I needed to understand the full picture before I confronted her. That afternoon, I left the cafe and parked across the street where I could see the entrance without being obvious. I told myself I would leave if she didn't show up. I told myself I wasn't the kind of man who stalked his wife. But at 6:17 p.m., her silver sedan turned into the parking lot. My breath caught. She stepped out of the car wearing a soft pink shawl I hadn't seen before. She looked expectant, not nervous, not conflicted, expectant. 5 minutes later, a dark blue SUV pulled in. A man stepped out, mid-40s, tall, confident posture, the same man from the night before. He smiled the moment he saw her. She smiled back. No hesitation, no guilt, just warmth. They didn't rush inside. They stood near her car for a moment, speaking closely. Then he reached out and gently touched her elbow as they walked toward the cafe together. That simple touch shattered something final inside me. It wasn't just physical closeness, it was familiarity, ownership. I felt like I was watching a scene from someone else's marriage, except the wife was mine. I stayed in the car for 20 minutes, staring at the cafe entrance, fighting the urge to storm inside and demand answers. But anger, I realized, would not give me clarity. It would only give me chaos, and I needed clarity. I drove home before they came out. I didn't want to see them leave together. I didn't want to see how they said goodbye. At home, I sat in the living room and stared at the family photographs on the wall. There we were at Murray, wrapped in shawls, smiling. The next few days felt like I was living inside a carefully constructed experiment. I observed, I recorded, I stayed quiet. I became a stranger in my own home, studying the woman I had once known better than myself. Sana did not notice the shift in me, or if she did, she attributed it to work stress. I allowed her to believe that. Every lie she told now sounded rehearsed, almost gentle in its delivery. "There's a staff dinner tonight. The principal asked me to stay late. One of the parents needs extra consultation." Each sentence was smooth, controlled, and every time she spoke, I wondered if she heard herself the way I heard her. I began checking small details, the mileage on her car, the timestamps on her messages when her phone lit up beside her, the way she angled her screen away from me when typing. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but once you see cracks in glass, you cannot unsee them. I hated what I was becoming, suspicious, quiet, calculating. This wasn't the husband I had been for 23 years, but that husband had trusted without question, and trust had brought me to that cafe window. On Thursday afternoon, I left work early again and parked across from the plaza. I told myself this would be the last time. I needed one undeniable moment, one that removed all remaining doubt. At 6:10 p.m., she arrived. At 6:16 p.m., he did. They greeted each other differently this time, not cautious, not scanning their surroundings. He pulled her gently into a brief embrace. She rested her head against his chest for a second longer than politeness allowed. I felt the air leave my lungs. That embrace was not new. It was practiced, comfortable. I stepped out of my car before I could overthink it. My legs carried me forward, steady and numb. I walked directly into the cafe. The bell above the door chimed. Their table was only a few steps in. They hadn't noticed me yet. He was saying something softly. She was smiling, her hand already resting near his. I stopped beside their table. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then Sana looked up. Her eyes met mine. The color drained from her face instantly. "Imran," she whispered. His hand withdrew from hers as if burned. He turned toward me, confusion flashing across his features. I looked at him calmly. "Good evening," I said. My voice surprised even me. It was steady, almost polite. "Is this the parent-teacher meeting?" The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. Sana stood up abruptly. "Imran, please." "Please what?" I interrupted gently. I wasn't shouting. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. The man cleared his throat awkwardly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I looked at him directly. "What is your name?" He hesitated. Sana closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. "His name is Faraz," she said quietly. I nodded. "Faraz," I repeated. "How long have you been meeting my wife?" His jaw tightened. He glanced at Sana, silently asking for direction. She looked shattered now, not because she was caught with another man, but because her two worlds had collided. 8 months, she whispered. There it was, not from a guard, not from observation, from her own lips. 8 months. I absorbed it slowly. "Do you love him?" I asked her. The question hung between us, fragile and sharp. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation was answer enough. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Something inside me went quiet at that moment. Not explosive, not dramatic, just quiet, as if a long argument inside my heart had ended. Faraz stood awkwardly, unsure whether to defend himself or disappear. I looked at him once more. "I don't blame you," I said calmly. "You didn't break vows with me." Then I turned back to Sana. "But you did." Tears rolled down her cheeks freely now. "Imran, I never meant to hurt you." I almost smiled at the absurdity of that sentence. "You don't mean to hurt someone for 8 months," I replied softly. "You choose it." A few customers had begun watching. The waiter stood frozen near the counter. I didn't want a scene. I had dignity left, and I intended to keep it. "I'm going home. You can come now or later, but when you walk through that door, you will tell me everything. No more meetings, no more lies." She nodded weakly. I left without looking back. The drive home felt different from the night I first saw them. There was no confusion now, only clarity. Painful, sharp clarity. When she entered the house an hour later, her eyes were swollen from crying. She stood in the doorway of the living room, like a visitor, unsure if she was welcome. I gestured toward the sofa. "Sit." She obeyed quietly. For the first time in our marriage, there was no routine politeness between us, just truth waiting to be spoken. "Start from the beginning," I said. She inhaled shakily. "I met him at a school seminar. He was a guest speaker. We exchanged numbers for professional reasons." She paused. "It started as conversations about books, about work. He listened, Imran. He asked about my thoughts, my feelings." The words stung more than any confession of physical betrayal. "And I didn't?" I asked quietly. She looked down. "You used to, but somewhere we stopped talking like that." I sat back slowly. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I forced myself to listen. "I felt invisible," she continued. "After the girls left, the house felt empty. You were always tired. I didn't want to burden you. Faraz made me feel seen." Seen. I thought about the years I worked overtime to pay university fees, the weekends I fixed. She sat across from me for a long time without speaking. I could see the storm behind her eyes, the calculation, the fear, the grief. It struck me then that this was not only my marriage ending or surviving, it was her illusion collapsing. For 8 months, she had lived inside a divided world. Now she had to choose which half was real. "I never wanted to leave our family," she whispered finally. "That's not what this was." I held her gaze steadily. "Then what was it?" She wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers. "It was escape. It was feeling young again, feeling heard, not just as a mother, not just as your wife, as myself." Her words were raw, and in another life, maybe I would have reached across and comforted her. But tonight, comfort felt misplaced. "You could have told me you felt invisible," I said quietly. "We could have worked on it." She shook her head faintly. "You were always so tired, so focused on responsibility. I didn't want to add to your burden." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marriage isn't about protecting each other from honesty," I replied. "It's about surviving it." She closed her eyes. "I know that now." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. 23 years of shared mornings, shared illnesses, shared celebrations, reduced to this one fragile conversation. "Do you love him?" I asked again, more calmly this time. She swallowed hard. "I care about him." That wasn't the same answer as before. I noticed it. "And do you love me?" I asked. That question seemed to hurt her more than anything else. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, very softly, "I don't know." I nodded once. I appreciated the honesty, even though it sliced cleanly through me. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It fades quietly, unattended. Maybe I had mistaken endurance for devotion. "Call him," I said gently. She looked up, startled. "Now?" "Yes. Put him on speaker." Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She scrolled briefly and pressed his name. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Sanaa?" His voice carried through the room, warm, concerned. She glanced at me, terrified. I gave her a small nod. "Faraz," she began, her voice unsteady. "Imran knows." Silence filled the line. Then a sharp inhale. "Are you okay?" he asked her immediately. That simple question told me everything about his priorities. "I'm fine, but we can't continue like this." Another pause. "What are you saying?" he asked. She closed her eyes tightly. "I'm saying I have to decide about my marriage." I stepped in gently. "There is no decision," I said clearly, my voice steady but firm. "If she remains my wife, you disappear completely. No calls, no meetings, nothing." Faraz's tone shifted slightly, defensive. "With respect, this isn't just your choice." I leaned closer to the phone. "It became my choice the moment vows were broken." There was a long silence. Then he spoke more quietly. "Sanaa, what do you want?" Her breathing grew heavier. Tears streamed down her face again. I watched her carefully, not with anger now, but with clarity. This was her moment, not mine. "I want my family," she whispered. The words landed between us with fragile weight. On the other end of the line, Faraz exhaled slowly. I imagined him processing the reality that his secret world had ended. "I see," he said finally. There was hurt in his voice, but also acceptance. "Then I won't contact you again." The call ended, just like that. 8 months reduced to a disconnected tone. Sanaa lowered the phone slowly and began sobbing, not quietly, but deeply, like someone grieving something real. And perhaps she was. I sat there, watching the woman I loved mourn another man. It was one of the most humbling experiences of my life, not because I felt small, but because I understood that love is complicated. It does not divide neatly into right and wrong. It expands, it misguides, it seeks what it lacks. "Are you staying?" I asked after a while. She nodded, unable to speak. "Then understand this," I said gently but firmly. "Staying is not the same as going back. What we had is broken. If we rebuild, it will be different." She wiped her face and looked at me with desperate sincerity. "I'll do anything." I shook my head slightly. "Not anything, just honesty." That night, we didn't sleep in the same bed. I moved to the guest room, not because of punishment, but because space felt necessary. The house felt different, emptier, yet strangely clearer. There were no more secrets floating between walls, only consequences. Over the next few days, reality settled in. She blocked his number, deleted messages in front of me, not to erase evidence, but to mark an ending. She gave me access to her phone willingly. I didn't check it often. I didn't want to live like a guard at my own gate, but the transparency mattered. Conversations between us became raw, sometimes painful. She admitted she had enjoyed the attention. I admitted I had grown complacent. We talked about the years after our daughters left, the silence that had grown unnoticed between us. For the first time in a long while, we weren't discussing bills or schedules. We were discussing ourselves. It was uncomfortable, honest, necessary. One evening, about a week later, she looked at me across the dining table and said something that surprised me. "Healing, I learned, is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with grand speeches or cinematic apologies. It arrives quietly, in small, consistent choices, in uncomfortable conversations, in long silences that don't turn into escape." The weeks after that night felt fragile, like walking across glass that had been carefully pieced back together. One wrong step and everything could shatter again. Sanaa tried in ways that were visible and invisible. She came home directly after work. She left her phone on the kitchen counter without hesitation. She began initiating conversations, not about groceries or bills, but about us. At first, I struggled to respond. Not because I didn't care, but because something inside me was still bracing for impact. Trust, once broken, doesn't grow back overnight. It grows in inches. One evening, about 3 weeks later, we sat on the porch after dinner. The air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. We used to sit like this often when the girls were younger, sipping tea and discussing their futures. That night, it felt like we were discussing our own. "Do you hate me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her carefully. "No," I said honestly. "I was hurt, I was angry, but hate is something else." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I hated myself for a while," she admitted, "for risking everything." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my mind. "If I hadn't found out, would you have stopped?" The question made her flinch. She stared out at the streetlights for a long moment. "I don't know," she said finally. And that honesty, painful as it was, felt cleaner than any comforting lie. Over the next month, we started seeing a marriage counselor. It wasn't something we talked about publicly. In our culture, people often hide these struggles, but I had learned the cost of hiding. The counselor didn't take sides. She asked uncomfortable questions. When was the last time you felt emotionally close? When did routine replace curiosity? When did you stop asking each other who you were becoming? Those sessions forced us to confront something deeper than the affair. We had stopped seeing each other long before Faraz entered the picture. I had buried myself in responsibility. Sanaa had buried herself in silence. We were functioning partners, not evolving companions. That realization didn't excuse her betrayal, but it explained the soil where it grew. One afternoon, while cleaning the study, I found an old photo album, our wedding day. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages slowly. There she was at 26, nervous and radiant. There I was, standing beside her with a confidence that only youth carries. I remembered the vows we recited, not perfectly, but sincerely. I remembered promising to choose her, even when choosing became difficult. That word stayed with me. Choose. Love is not sustained by feeling alone. It is sustained by decision. That night, I brought the album to the living room and placed it between us. She looked at it with tears in her eyes. "We were so young," she said softly. "We still are," I replied gently, "just older." For the first time since everything unraveled, she smiled without guilt behind it, a small, genuine smile. It wasn't the spark I saw in the cafe. It was something steadier, something earned. Slowly, our routines shifted. We began walking together in the evenings. We cooked meals side by side instead of separately. We asked each other questions we hadn't asked in years. What scares you now? What do you still dream about? The answers surprised us both. She admitted she feared becoming irrelevant as she aged. I admitted I feared being unappreciated for the sacrifices I made. We had both been afraid. We had just never said it out loud. There were setbacks, nights when the image of that cafe table returned uninvited, moments when her phone buzzing made my stomach tighten instinctively. But instead of withdrawing, I spoke, and instead of deflecting, she reassured. Trust was not returning in its old form. It was rebuilding as transparency. One evening, about 2 months later, she sat across from me and said something that settled deeply into my chest. "I don't miss him," she said quietly. I studied her face carefully. There was no drama there, just clarity. "I miss the version of myself I thought I was when I was with him." That distinction mattered. It wasn't about the man. It was about what she felt lacking in herself, and that was something we could address together. Around that same time, our daughters came home for a weekend visit. Watching Sanaa with them, laughing in the kitchen, arguing playfully over recipes, I felt a mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude that we had not destroyed the family entirely, grief that it had come so close. I didn't tell the girls. Some truths protect, others burden. This one, for now, remained ours. One night after they left, Sanaa sat beside me and took my hand gently. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she said. I looked at her fingers intertwined with mine, the same hand I had seen across that cafe table months earlier. The memory still existed, but it no longer owned me. "Thank you for choosing to stay," I replied. And that was the quiet truth. She had chosen, not out of fear, not out of exposure, but because when forced to weigh fantasy against foundation, she understood which one could endure storms. Our marriage was not the same. It would never be the untouched version from before. But in some ways, it was more honest now, less polished, more intentional. I no longer assumed love would sustain itself. I participated in it, and she did too. Sometimes I think about the elderly security guard who first spoke to me, how easily he could have stayed silent, how differently my life might have unfolded if he had. Betrayal exposed us, but it also revealed what was neglected, and sometimes truth feels cruel before it feels cleansing. I won't pretend everything became perfect. There are still days when doubt whispers, but doubt no longer controls the narrative. It has been a year now since the night an elderly security guard looked at me and quietly asked, "Is that your wife?" Sometimes I still hear his voice in my mind, not as a warning, but as a turning point. Life did not split into before and after in a dramatic explosion. It shifted gradually, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface until the landscape rearranged itself. If you had walked into our home today, you would not see broken glass or raised voices. You would see two people making tea together. You would hear ordinary conversation. You would see something that looks unremarkable. But what you would not see is the quiet, deliberate effort beneath it all. That is the part no one talks about. There was a time, in the weeks after the confrontation, when I believed I would never look at Sana the same way again. And in a sense, I was right. I don't look at her the same way. I look at her more clearly. I no longer see the idealized version of the woman I married at 26. I see a human being capable of loneliness, mistakes, selfishness, and growth, and she sees the same in me. Strangely, that clarity has brought a deeper intimacy than the comfort we once mistook for connection. One evening not long ago, we hosted a small dinner for close friends. Laughter filled the house. The same dining table that once held heavy silence now held warmth again. At one point, I caught Sana's eye across the room. It wasn't a dramatic glance, just a small, shared look. But in that look was awareness. We both knew how close we had come to losing all of this. That knowledge made the moment richer. Gratitude is a powerful glue. I won't pretend forgiveness was a straight path. There were nights when the memory returned without invitation. A scent, a passing cafe, a stray thought at 2 a.m. Sometimes I would wake and stare at the ceiling, the image of her across from him flashing briefly in my mind. The difference now is that I don't let that image define the present. When doubt whispers, I speak it aloud. And when I do, she doesn't grow defensive. She answers calmly, reassures without irritation. Trust, I've learned, is rebuilt not by grand promises, but by consistent patience. A few months ago, Sana did something unexpected. She suggested we revisit the plaza together. At first, I thought she was testing herself, or testing me. But when she explained, her reasoning was simple. I don't want that place to own part of our story, she said. So one Saturday afternoon, we drove there side by side. My heart beat a little faster as the building came into view. The same parking lot, the same cafe sign. The elderly guard was still there, though he leaned more heavily on his railing now. He recognized us both. There was no accusation in his eyes, only quiet understanding. Sana walked up to him before I could. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked confused. "For what, madam?" "For telling my husband the truth." The guard glanced at me, then back at her. Truth is not always welcome, but sometimes it saves what lies would destroy. We stood there in silence for a moment, 3 strangers connected by one painful evening. Then Sana slipped her hand into mine, not as a display, not for anyone else to see, just instinctively. And this time, I didn't feel the ghost of another hand between us. We didn't go inside the cafe. We didn't need to. The building no longer held power over us. It was just brick and glass again. What I've come to understand is this. Betrayal is not always the end of love, but it is always the end of illusion. The version of our marriage that existed before was comfortable, but it was also complacent. We assumed we would always be fine because we had always been fine. We stopped tending to the small things, the questions, the curiosity, the emotional check-ins. We confused stability with connection, and in that quiet neglect, space opened, space that someone else stepped into. I do not excuse what she did, and she does not excuse it either. Accountability remains part of our foundation now. But I also no longer see the affair as a simple story of villain and victim. It was the result of 2 people drifting silently apart while sharing the same roof. The difference is that one of us crossed a line instead of addressing the distance, and that line forced both of us to wake up. A few weeks ago, on our 24th anniversary, we did something simple. No grand party, no expensive dinner. We sat on the porch with tea, just like we did when the girls were young. The sky was streaked with soft orange, fading into blue. Sana turned to me and asked, "If you could go back to that night and choose not to see, would you?" The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully. The pain, the humiliation, the months of rebuilding. I could choose ignorance. I could choose comfort over truth. But then I looked at her, at the honesty in her expression now, at the effort we both make daily, and I shook my head. "No," I said quietly, because we were already breaking. I just didn't know it yet. She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. Not tears of guilt this time, tears of recognition. Our daughters still don't know the full story. Perhaps one day they will. Perhaps they won't. What matters is that the home they return to feels solid, not because it is flawless, but because it is intentional. They see us talk more, laugh more, disagree respectfully. They see partnership, not performance. And maybe that is the real lesson. I think often about that initial question, when did I stop being enough? I realize now that it was the wrong question. Marriage is not about being enough as a static measurement. It is about staying engaged, about continuing to learn who the other person is becoming. I had not stopped being enough. I had stopped paying attention, and she had stopped speaking up before resentment grew roots. We both contributed to the distance. Only one of us crossed a boundary, but both of us had ignored the warning signs. If you are listening to this and living inside quiet distance, do not wait for a security guard to point out what you refuse to see. Ask the hard questions early. Speak the uncomfortable truth before someone else becomes the audience for it. Love does not survive on autopilot. It survives on awareness. The night behind that glass door felt like the end of everything I believed about my life. But in truth, it was the beginning of something more honest. It has been a year now since the night an elderly security guard looked at me and quietly asked, "Is that your wife?" Sometimes I still hear his voice in my mind, not as a warning, but as a turning point. Life did not split into before and after in a dramatic explosion. It shifted gradually, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface until the landscape rearranged itself. If you had walked into our home today, you would not see broken glass or raised voices. You would see two people making tea together. You would hear ordinary conversation. You would see something that looks unremarkable, but what you would not see is the quiet, deliberate effort beneath it all. That is the part no one talks about. There was a time in the weeks after the confrontation when I believed I would never look at Sana the same way again, and in a sense, I was right. I don't look at her the same way. I look at her more clearly. I no longer see the idealized version of the woman I married at 26. I see a human being capable of loneliness, mistakes, selfishness, and growth, and she sees the same in me. Strangely, that clarity has brought a deeper intimacy than the comfort we once mistook for connection. One evening, not long ago, we hosted a small dinner for close friends. Laughter filled the house. The same dining table that once held heavy silence now held warmth again. At one point, I caught Sana's eye across the room. It wasn't a dramatic glance, just a small, shared look. But in that look was awareness. We both knew how close we had come to losing all of this. That knowledge made the moment richer. Gratitude is a powerful glue. I won't pretend forgiveness was a straight path. There were nights when the memory returned without invitation, a scent, a passing cafe, a stray thought at 2 a.m. Sometimes I would wake and stare at the ceiling, the image of her across from him flashing briefly in my mind. The difference now is that I don't let that image define the present. When doubt whispers, I speak it aloud. And when I do, she doesn't grow defensive. She answers calmly, reassures without irritation. Trust, I've learned, is rebuilt not by grand promises, but by consistent patience. A few months ago, Sana did something unexpected. She suggested we revisit the plaza together. At first, I thought she was testing herself, or testing me, but when she explained, her reasoning was simple. "I don't want that place to own part of our story," she said. So one Saturday afternoon, we drove there side by side. My heart beat a little faster as the building came into view. The same parking lot, the same cafe sign. The elderly guard was still there, though he leaned more heavily on his railing now. He recognized us both. There was no accusation in his eyes, only quiet understanding. Sana walked up to him before I could. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked confused. "For what, madam?" for telling my husband the truth. The guard glanced at me, then back at her. Truth is not always welcome, but sometimes it saves what lies would destroy. We stood there in silence for a moment, 3 strangers connected by one painful evening. Then Sana slipped her hand into mine, not as a display, not for anyone else to see, just instinctively. And this time I didn't feel the ghost of another hand between us. We didn't go inside the cafe, we didn't need to. The building no longer held power over us. It was just brick and glass again. What I've come to understand is this: betrayal is not always the end of love, but it is always the end of illusion. The version of our marriage that existed before was comfortable, but it was also complacent. We assumed we would always be fine because we had always been fine. We stopped tending to the small things, the questions, the curiosity, the emotional check-ins. We confused stability with connection, and in that quiet neglect, space opened, space that someone else stepped into. I do not excuse what she did, and she does not excuse it either. Accountability remains part of our foundation now. But I also no longer see the affair as a simple story of villain and victim. It was the result of 2 people drifting silently apart while still sharing the same roof. The difference is that one of us crossed a line instead of addressing the distance, and that line forced both of us to wake up. A few weeks ago, on our 24th anniversary, we did something simple. No grand party, no expensive dinner. We sat on the porch with tea just like we used to when the girls were young. The sky was streaked with soft orange, fading into blue. Sana turned to me and asked me, if you could go back to that night and choose not to see, would you? The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully. The pain, the humiliation, the months of rebuilding. I could choose ignorance. I could choose comfort over truth. But then I looked at her, at the honesty in her expression now, at the effort we both make daily, and I shook my head. No, I said quietly, because we were already breaking. I just didn't know it yet. She nodded slowly.